This is the meeting of the British Astronomical Association in London at the Institute of Physics. This is our June meeting, and it's lovely to see you all here. Thank you all very much for coming, and I think we're also broadcasting on YouTube, so there'll be some watchers on YouTube, and I'll have a look at that, and they might be able to contribute as well. They can ask questions in the chat there, if they can work out how to do that. So I'm the president, David Ardisi. I'm sorry you've had such a lot of messing about today, because this is where the meeting should have been, in this lecture theatre, but due to some miscommunication within the Institute of Physics, we thought we would have to have the meeting upstairs, so we were all directed upstairs at an earlier stage, and only some of the lifts were working. But now it's transpired that we can have the meeting here, and we've got the technician with us, which is great. So the first thing I always do is welcome new members of the BAA. So anybody who is a new member or who has never been to a BAA meeting, if they'd like to introduce themselves to me, then I will formally welcome them as president to the association. And I know we have one such person. We have Robert Law here. So Robert, could you come up? Thanks. Robert's come all the way from Dundee. And I met Robert at the recent meeting. We had a meeting. We had a meeting in Greenock recently, which went very well. So
I'm an astronomer, and I was actually a member of the BAA about 40 years ago when I was younger, back in the 70s when I was a teenager, you know, so I got to meet Patrick, was a good friend of mine, and Commander Henry Hatfield, you know, and a good friend Harry Ford, who he was at the Mills, I work at the Mills Observatory. And before I was there, I was at the Coates Observatory in Paisley doing the public viewing, and I'm an honorary member of the Airdrie Astronomical Association and a past curator. So if you ever want to talk about the Scottish observatories, we'll get a history of observatories in Scotland.
Yeah, that would be great. Unfortunately, the Mills Observatory is under threat. The Dundee City Council has decided they don't want to carry on funding it. So I'm going to write a letter on behalf of the BAA trying to persuade them to carry on supporting it. And there's also a petition that everybody can sign. And on the BAA website, on the BAA forum, there's a link to that. So, or you can look it up easily enough. So please do lend your support to that campaign to keep the Mills Observatory open. Right, well, welcome to the association. Anyway, I hope you have many happy years with us. Right. Any other new members? Oh, one over here. Would you like to come up, or just?
It's okay, I'll stay here.
Just say your name. Yes.
I'm Dennis Tim. I did a degree in astronomy many years ago and worked at UCL Observatory demonstrating before joining the computer science department at UCL. I've retired now. I'm interested in all things RF, so I'm particularly interested in the pulsar talk, which is the second.
Right. Another radio enthusiast, radio astronomy enthusiast. Right, well, welcome to the association. I hope you have a nice association with us. We have approved some papers for publication in the journal at the council meeting today, and the paper secretary, Jeremy Shears, will now tell you what they will be, what they are.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, 3 papers were accepted for publication in the journal. They are the 2022 to 2023 Elongation of Venus by Paul Abel, Characteristics of Sunspot-Associated H-alpha Plage by Fred Nye, and another paper by Paul Abel, The Total Solar Eclipse Expedition to Waxahachie, Texas, USA. Thank you.
It's the academic.
A lot of things of interest there. I'm sure many of you saw that eclipse and have your own adventures about it.
Oh, yeah.
Which you could write to the journal telling us about. Now I'll give you some notices about future meetings. We always have cordial relations with the Webb Deep Sky Society, and they hold their annual meeting on the 15th of June at the Institute of Astronomy in Cambridge, and that's open to BAA members as well. So if you want to find out about that, I think that's on our website as well, on the BAA website. The next BAA meeting will be a whole day meeting on Saturday the 21st of September. It will be held at the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory, Didcot in Oxfordshire. It will be on the topic of current research highlights. This is highlights of professional astronomy. We'll be having talks about black holes and I can't remember what else, but gravitational waves. So there's quite a roster of leading experts on those subjects who are going to talk to us. And you can book for that. You need to book for that to go to that. You need to book, but the booking is not yet open, but it will open in a week or two. And there's more information about that on the BAA website. So that's the 21st of September. Then the next meeting that we hold here at the Institute of Physics will be our annual general meeting, which will be on Wednesday, the 30th of October at 17:30 again. And that will be the end of the 2023 to 24 session, the start of the next session, and we will have a transfer of president. I will become vice president, and we are electing a new president, and you will receive the ballot paper shortly. But I can tell you that the candidate on that ballot paper, who I have proposed to be the next president, is Janice McLean. So I'm sure you will welcome her and give her an easy time. But she won't actually be present in October. She will take over at the Christmas meeting in December. So we'll move on now to our talks. And every year we have a lecture called the George Alcock Memorial Lecture. And this is memorializing a very famous observer, G.E.D. Alcock, who discovered 5 novae and 5 comets visually. And every year we remember him, and his achievement will never be surpassed in this. It will probably never be repeated in this day of electronic surveys. He did all that visually with binoculars, basically. So the George Alcock Memorial Lecture this year is being given by Professor Bill Leatherbarrow. Bill will be well known to most of you. He's former director of the BAA Lunar section. He was much involved with the Mercury and Venus section also in the past. Very dedicated, long-standing planetary observer, former president, and he's received the Goodacre Medal. And this year he's giving a talk entitled Making an Impact, the Craters of the Moon. So please welcome Professor Leatherbarrow.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks also to the BAA for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a great honour and a great pleasure. My membership of the BAA overlaps to a certain extent with that of George Alcock, but our paths never crossed. I never met him. I was never at a meeting that he was at. I didn't know him, but I do know enough about him to feel slightly embarrassed about giving a talk about the craters of the moon, because, you know, George was many things, but he was not. People are nodding here. He was not an observer of the moon, and I rather suspect that our satellite was regarded by him as being a bit of a nuisance that got in the way of his normal observations. I did try to justify my talk tonight in vain. I tried looking for hours for that giveaway photograph of George, crouched enthusiastically over a telescope pointed at the moon, but I never found it. But I do take some comfort from the fact that the very first observation that propelled George on his career was an observation of the moon. In fact, you know, if I'm honest, it was actually covering the sun at the time, It was the April 1921 large partial eclipse, but that was George's first observation. So, you know, no excuses. I have to fall back on the fact that the terms of this lecture are that it can be on any aspect of observational astronomy. And I do hope that this talk this evening will persuade some of you to look again at these holes in the ground, at these craters of the moon, and perhaps come to the conclusion that I came to some time ago, that they're really quite interesting. Okay, let's get down to business. The existence of widespread cratering on the moon has been known really since the invention of the telescope, since the time of Galileo and the British astronomer Thomas Harriot, both of whom made independent telescopic drawings of the moon around about 1609, 1610, shortly after the invention of the telescope. Now, of course, the telescopes at that time were poor, they were difficult to use, and the sketches made by both Galileo and Harriot are rudimentary. You see them here. The sketch on the left is by Thomas Harriot, and the drawings on the right are by Galileo. And they're an interesting comparison. They're quite different. You know, if you look at Harriot's sketch, it's all of a map, isn't it? If you look at Harriot's map on the left, it shows clearly that his approach towards observing the moon is essentially cartographic. You know, he's setting out to map as accurately as possible the disposition of the features that he can see on the lunar surface. In other words, his approach is geographical. Yeah? It's where they are, where the craters are, how they're disposed. But Galileo's drawings are much more artistic. Yeah? They have a much more immediate appeal. But they're very different. It's actually, they're less accurate. It's very difficult to identify on Galileo's sketches individual features. They're the wrong size, they're in the wrong place, they're not readily identifiable, you can't put names to them. And it's clear from these sketches that Galileo, unlike Harriot, wasn't interested in mapping the moon or showing it as it appears. He was much more interested in trying to present or represent the nature rather than the disposition of what he could see through the telescope. So his approach we can discuss as being geological rather than geographical. We see the craters of the moon not for what they are, but for where they are. Now, I've got no wish to neglect or disparage that great tradition of lunar mapping that was initiated by Harriot and which continued right the way through until the 20th century and the advent of the space age. Not least because this association, the BAA, played such a remarkable role in that whole historical process of mapping the moon. Great lunar mappers like Elgar and Goodacre spring to mind immediately. So the BAA has played a terrific part in that history of lunar mapping. But that's not really going to be my topic this evening. I want this evening to follow the tradition that was established here by Galileo and to concentrate on the nature, on trying to understand the nature and the formation processes that go into creating the craters of the moon. Now, looking around the room this evening, and please don't be offended at this, but I see that there are people here who, like me, are of a certain age and are able to perhaps recall that classic 1962 study of the cratering process by Cribbins. I don't know whether you remember this. Cribbins came to some remarkable conclusions, and you can see two of them here. What do they say? So big and sort of round it was. There we are, that's true. And it was flat at the bottom and the sides were steep. So, you know, But we can go further than that. A lot of time has passed by since Cribbett's classic contribution to this. We can do better than this. And that's what I want to try and concentrate on this evening, looking rather more closely at the processes that go into creating the craters of the moon. Now, in many respects, it was the English natural philosopher, Robert Hooke. I'm having a problem with this. It seems to require... Robert Hooke, would you buy a second-hand car from it was Robert Hooke who, in his publication Micrographia in 1665, he came up with essentially two distinct theories of lunar crater formation, and he's putting down his marker for being the father of lunar geology or selenology. And he based his theories on practical experiments. I mean, first of all, he tried dropping pistol balls into a bowl of moist pipe clay, whatever that is, obviously fashionable in the 17th century. But firing or throwing pistol balls into moist clay produced convincing, to him at least, convincing crater-like depressions that looked a bit like the craters that we can see on the moon. And, you know, in one fell swoop, he creates the impact theory of lunar crater formation at that moment. But Hooke kind of stood back from this because he couldn't imagine, he couldn't envisage, you know, what kind of projectiles would be floating around that would be big enough, you know, to create so many huge craters that we see on the lunar surface. He just couldn't imagine where they would come from. Now, some of you might remember a few years back on an episode of The Sky at Night, Alan Chapman and Patrick Moore tried to recreate this, you know, firing pellets into pipe clay. There we are. This is a still from that program. That's Chapman on the, he's the projectile, or firing the projectile, and Patrick is watching. It ended, of course, with Patrick being covered in impact ejectors. But from that moment onwards, I've always looked upon these two as being the sort of Morecambe and Wise of impact theory. But there we are. So, because he couldn't imagine the kind of projectiles that would be required, Hooke came up with an alternative theory, which is that the craters of the moon are more likely to be the consequence of some kind of volcanic process. And here he experimented again with boiling alabaster. And when the bubbles came to the surface and burst, they left crater-like depressions on the surface of the alabaster, which once again looked like the craters of the moon. But of course, there's a huge difference between, you know, a 1-inch crater on a bowl of alabaster and the 180-mile diameter crater Bailey on the moon. But Hooke stood with the volcanic theory, and that volcanic theory, as I said earlier, endured right the way through until the 20th century, possibly largely because, you know, most of the craters that we knew on Earth were volcanic craters rather than impact craters. Impact craters on the Earth have largely been eroded by the passing of time. But the problem is, and I think, you know, I think that Hooke was aware of this, the problem again is one of scale, because none of the volcanic processes that we're familiar with on Earth, you know, seem to be possible, you know, ways of giving rise to craters like, as I said before, the crater Bailey, which is 180 miles across. There's a huge difference of scale here, which you know, worried Hooke, and in fact went on to worry adherents of the volcanic theory for a long time afterwards. If we look, for example, at Naismith and Carpenter's fountain theory of crater formation, this is sort of late 19th century. I think the pictures are self-explanatory, but the idea that material is from inside the moon is thrown up through a central vent, a crack in the surface, and it flies out like a fountain and falls to form a circular rim around the crater. I don't want to go into detail about this, but it effectively it doesn't cut the mustard, it doesn't hold water. There's no comparable mechanism on Earth. So why should there be a mechanism like that on the moon? And neither did, for example, Patrick Moore's theory of volcanic crater formation hold water either. He came up with the idea of giant bubbles, whereby subsurface magma under pressure forces up the surface of the moon into a dome, and that dome then bursts and it collapses to form a crater. Very nice, but very wrong. So we need to look again at what we're dealing with here. Because the thing is that impact theory, as Hooke recognised, was also beset by problems of scale, or at least it was until the late 19th and 20th century. And how big would an impactor have to be in order to excavate something as colossal as a crater like Clavius, or a crater like Bailey? And the problem was that word excavate. Because Hooke and others were looking at crater formation, impact crater formation, whereby craters were excavated by a projectile, dug out by a projectile. And that's simply not enough to explain the huge size of lunar craters. No matter how big a bullet you fire into the lunar surface, you're not going to make a crater the size of the ones that we see on the moon. And it was the American, Ralph Baldwin, who first came up with a way of getting around this problem of scale in his 1949 book, The Face of the Moon. He first, in this book, fully articulated the consequences of even a medium-sized impactor arriving at the lunar surface at interplanetary velocities. In other words, it's not just a matter of the size of the impactor, you've got to take into account the speed at which that impactor arrives and hits a non-resilient or a resistant, hard lunar surface. When an asteroid or a comet or a meteor traveling perhaps at speeds of in excess of 20 kilometers a second, when it's suddenly arrested by impact with the lunar surface, what happens is you get an instantaneous, explosive release of vast amounts of energy, way in excess of the energies involved in a bullet striking clay or a bullet striking rock or anything. And it was an idea that had been put forward earlier in the 19th century by a New Zealand scientist called Algernon Charles Gifford. And he'd recognized that, in his words, I'm quoting him here, a meteorite moving at a speed of many miles a second has a store of kinetic energy which renders it, when suddenly stopped, an explosive of unparalleled violence. So he's got to the core of things here. But it was Baldwin who pushed that further and took that idea of the lunar craters being the result of a single point explosion. He took it further and developed it into a kind of consistent theory of lunar crater formation. For example, one of the problems that had faced earlier impact theory, where you fire something into a surface and it excavates the crater, is that most of the craters on the moon are round. But it's unreasonable to assume that the impactors that created them came from directly above, all of them, to create a round excavation. A lot of these impactors are going to arrive at angles. And if they arrive at angles and they're simply excavating the surface, you've got to end up with a crater that is perhaps elliptical in shape, non-round in shape, irregular in shape. Why, therefore, are the majority of craters on the moon round? And the answer is the answer come up with by Gifford and Baldwin. These craters are not the result simply of excavation, the result of a huge release of explosive energy at a single point. And the fact that it occurs at a single point means that you end up with a round crater. The size of the impactors that created the craters on the moon, it's very difficult to be precise about this. They could be anything from, the size of a motor car to perhaps 250 kilometers in diameter. It all depends not just on the size of the impactor, but also the speed at which it arrived. The Imbrium Basin, for example, the current thinking is that it was created by an impactor that was indeed about 250 kilometers in diameter, but arriving at a relatively slow speed of about 8 kilometers a second. So there we are. Now, it goes without saying that all lunar impact craters aren't alike. They differ. And at the simplest level, you can divide them into simple and complex craters, as you see in this slide. And there's a clear distinction between these forms. If you look at a simple crater here on the top, you can see, you don't really need to point it on both screens. I can hardly see that one. But the simple crater is bowl-shaped. It really is straightforward. It's a bowl-shaped pit, whereas complex craters show rather more in the way of complicated features. For example, you'll see that the example at the bottom here has got, as well as having an excavation, it's also got a central peak. It's got terracing, complex, terracing at the in the side walls, and the floor, instead of being bowl-shaped, is flat. Now we'll come back to this in just a moment, but the point I'm trying to make for now is simply that lunar craters are not all alike. Despite Cribbin's assertion, they're not all flat at the bottom and the sides are steep. They might, they may look different in this way, but the great contribution made by Baldwin was that he came forward with a set of ideas which showed that although they may look different, they're all the results, they're all the consequences of the same basic impact process. And moreover, that family of craters, they're all from the same family, and that family of craters involves not just the pits on the moon, the depressions on the moon that we call craters, it also includes those vast impact basins that were later filled with lava, and which we now see as the Maria, the lunar seas, the features of the man in the moon. Baldwin was insistent that they are also part of this same process that creates impact cratering. Now, I'm aware of the fact that probably most people in this room have an interest in astronomy that focuses on dark nights and not on the moon and on the deep sky. So in order to keep you awake, I've come up with a hook to try and entice you into this. Deep sky observers, they have this thing called the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, don't they? You've heard of this. And that Hertzsprung-Russell diagram has a main sequence of stars, which accounts for perhaps not the majority, but a large number of the stars that we see in the sky. Now, you'll be delighted to know that I've come up with a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram for lunar craters, and I'd like to reveal this. Drum roll will be good. I'd like to reveal this. Now, look at that. There we are. Forgive my artistry, which is not up to much. You can see what I've done here. It's very simple. I've traced the diameter of lunar craters across the bottom here, and their morphological complexity is the vertical axis. And if you look at the craters that I've marked on my main sequence here, you can see that if you start with the sort of tiny ones, like the crater Linné, which is just a few kilometers across, they're small in diameter and very, very simple and very straightforward. By the time you get to the Orientale impact basin at the top of the diagram here, you're dealing with a different beast altogether. But the general rule of thumb here is that the bigger, the more complex morphologically a lunar crater is. And I want to look at that in a bit more a bit more detail. Let's go back to our simple crater. This picture here is it's obviously a spacecraft image of the crater Linné on the Mare Serenitatis, say just a few kilometers across, no more than that. And again, you could see that it's basically simple. It's bowl-shaped. It's got a sharp rim because it's a relatively recent crater. It's got a bit of scree on the floor, but it's very straightforward. And on the right of that image, you can also see what we currently understand to be the processes, the stages of the formation of that crater. You know, first of all, you get the arrival of the projectile, the impact coming at fast speed, hitting the lunar surface. It's obviously a relatively small projectile because it's going to create a relatively small crater. It hits the surface at great speed. It excavates a hole, so you do get a process of excavation initially. The energy generated at that moment vaporizes the impactor. It just disappears. And shock waves are sent down into the surface. But then, the middle row here, you get a stage whereby the material that's been excavated is flung out to form the rim of the crater, and the melted rock, the impact melt, begins to sort of trail down into the bowl of the crater, and it eventually settles down to look like something on the bottom row here. Pretty straightforward, nothing terribly exciting. Simple crater, simple process. But two stages, an excavation stage and then a modification stage as things settle down. Now, when we move on to more complex craters, I would say that simple craters like this are probably up to about 15 kilometers in diameter. Once you start getting above that, things start happening to craters that make them more complex. But let's leap to complex craters, craters that are perhaps over 40 kilometers in diameter. I'm thinking of craters like Theophilus or Copernicus. This image here is of the crater Theophilus. And you can see here that, it's got the features we talked about earlier. It's got a central peak, which the simple crater didn't have. It's got terracing on the inner walls, which the simple crater didn't have. And it's got ejecta surrounding it, which the simple crater didn't have. Also, the floor is relatively smooth and flat, rather than bowl-shaped. And again, this is the result of the processes we see on the right here. It starts off the same, the excavation stage, impactor arrives, great energy released, much more energy now because it's a larger impactor producing a larger crater. The impactor is evaporated in that huge explosion that occurs at that moment. Shock waves are sent down into the crust. And then it gets interesting, because such is the force of the explosion, such is the force of the energy released, that those downward shock waves rebound. The rock bounces back up again. Rather similar to what you see when you throw a stone into a pond or drop a stone into water, and you get the sort of ripple effect, but the water bounces back up again in a drop, as in this image here. And that accounts for the formation of the, going back, the central peak complex that you see in the middle of the crater. Also, vast amounts of rock have been melted by the force of the impact. And that impact melt gathers on the floor of the crater to form the flat floor. Also, such is the enormous amount of energy that's been released, and these huge shock waves, that the walls of the new crater can't withstand the force of gravity, and they collapse. They collapse into blocks of terracing that you can see on the image that you've got here. And also, finally, you get all kinds of rubbish thrown out by the explosion. Impact melt, rocks, stones, secondary impacts, all kinds of things surrounding the crater. So morphologically, you're dealing with a much more complicated object as you've gone up in size to something in excess of about 40 kilometers. Now, of course, this doesn't happen suddenly. There's no fixed size at which a simple crater transitions to becoming a complex crater. We do find intermediate forms of crater that have not yet reached the fully developed stage of a complex crater, but they're no longer just simple. And I've just got a single example here, which is the crater Dawes, which is about 18 kilometers in diameter, so bigger than the limit for a simple crater, not yet at the size that you get a fully formed complex crater. But you do find interesting developments morphologically here. There's been enough vibration and shaking going on to disturb the walls, not to the extent of forming fully formed terracing, but you can probably see here that there's a slump fallen out of the wall. It doesn't work over there. At the bottom of the image, you can see that a scallop has fallen out of the wall and slumped onto the floor of the crater. So no proper central peaks, but a lot of rubble on the floor. No proper terracing, but the bits of the wall have fallen away. Okay, so we've got kind of three stages now: simple, intermediate, and complex. Let's go up in size again. Now, similarly, there's no fixed point at which a large complex crater transitions to something even more complex. But the next stage up is what you might call protobasins, craters that have got ambitions to become impact basins, but they're not quite there. And this usually happens around about 150 to 200 kilometers in diameter. This is when things start to get really interesting. And the crater Compton, which is on the far side of the moon, is a good example here. At first glance, you think, oh, it's just a large complex crater. It's got all the ingredients. It's got flat floor, impact melt. It's got terracing. It's got a central peak complex. But it's also got something else that isn't perhaps immediately obvious. But surrounding that central peak complex, there's a ring of nascent, emerging hills. And that's, it's an incipient ring. It's not a proper ring yet, but it's a ring beginning to emerge, surrounding the central peak mass. Now, we need to go up again now in size in order to see what happens next. But by the time we reach, perhaps 300 kilometers in diameter, we're in the realm of what is called a peak ring basin. This is the crater Schrödinger, again on the far side of the moon. And again, it's not this color, all right? This is an elevation image of the moon. But you can see here all the ingredients of that incipient protobasin we saw before, except the central peak. There's no central peak now. Instead, there's a complete central peak ring instead of a central peak. Let's push it further. Let's go up yet again to the largest impact structures that you find on the moon. And they are the fully formed impact basins, like the Imbrium Basin or the Orientale Basin, which show evidence now, not just of a single ring, but of multiple rings, both inside the crater and indeed outside the basin. This is the Orientale. Again, it's half an elevation profile and half a straightforward image. But you can see clearly here that no central peak now, two inner rings, the rim, and then outside the rim, I'll show it on here, outside the rim here, there's an extraneous rim. We're dealing with a multi-ring impact basin, and we now know, of course, that these are to be found throughout many bodies in the solar system. This is perhaps the best example we've got close at hand on the moon. Unfortunately, of course, it's right on the edge of the moon for the telescopists, so you can't see it clearly, but there are wonderful images of it taken by spacecraft. The Orientale Basin is probably about, 930 kilometres in diameter. It's relatively young, 3.8 billion years old, and it shows well this multi-ringed impact structure. Okay, why? Why do we end up with rings? We can understand how you end up with a central peak. It's that water splashing back again. It's a rebound mechanism. But why rings? How do they form? Well, I'm glad to be able to reveal to you that the answer is unclear. The jury is still out on this. There are several theories that have been advanced. Baldwin, for example, thought that the rings were similar to the rings that, do you remember that picture I showed you, a stone going in the pond and you splash back, but you've also got the ripple rings around. And he thought they were similar to that, that they were caused by a kind of tsunami wave as a consequence of the forces of the impact, whereby material, rock, is fluidized by the force of impact and eventually kind of settles in rings around the central point of the impact. That's one idea. Another is that the rings are in fact complex rebound structures, just like the central peak is a rebound structure. These rings are rebound structures, but because the scale is so much greater, it comes up, settles down, comes up, settles down, and forms kind of rings rather than a single central peak complex. And then thirdly, there is the view that it's probably the favourite view at the moment, which is that they're caused by crustal deformation as a result of the forces of the impact and undulation in the crust caused by the force of the impact, creating concentric fractures and collapse scarps around the central point of impact. Now, as I say, the jury is still out. I think this general feeling nowadays that the sort of fluidized rock tsunami wave theory doesn't really hold water anymore. Now, this is all very clear, but of course, the problem with lunar craters is they've been around a long time, or lots of them have. I mean, most impact craters and most impact basins are between 1 and 4 billion years old on the moon. And it's obvious that the oldest of these have been around long enough to have been modified by subsequent events. And this could be a relatively simple form of modification, like we see with the crater Janssen. This image of Janssen is the sort of ruined formation here. But you can see that so much has gone on around it in terms of nearby impacts, ejecta from nearby impacts, that Janssen doesn't look anything like now what it looked like when it was first formed. So we've got to take this in mind, bear this in mind, that we're looking very often at modified forms of these constructs that I've been describing. I mean, some craters, we saw how craters end up with flat floors around the central peak because of molten lava or impact melt that has filled them. But sometimes, as in the case of the crater Plato, that flooding, the internal flooding of the crater, in Plato's case, it's with magma that's been extruded and flowed as lava over the surface. But that's taken care of the central peak, which would have been there. There's a central peak there underneath that solidified lava, but it's gone now and we don't see it, so we don't necessarily recognize Plato as once upon a time being a typical complex crater. It would have had terracing, it would have had a central peak. And also the great impact basins themselves have been hugely modified by the passing of time. This next slide, I think, is really quite intriguing. On the right, there's a representation of the moon as we see it today. And you've got sort of bright highland areas. They're part of the original lunar crust. And those darker areas are the so-called maria, the lunar seas, which are vast lava plains created when interior magma broke through to the surface through fractures in the surface and essentially flooded the large impact basins to form these relatively smooth areas. But what is really intriguing is the image on the left, which is a representation of what the moon would look like today, you know, if that process of the flooding of the impact basins by magma hadn't taken place. And you can clearly see multi-ringed impact basins all over the lunar surface. Sort of, you know, we don't see them anymore because those rings have been covered by the intrusion of magma at a later stage. Okay, so that's the kind of main story. That's the main sequence. But just as in the original Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, where you get stars that stubbornly refuse to fit into that main sequence, well, you get that on the moon as well. And you'll be thrilled to know that I haven't got a diagram to show you this. Yeah, but I want to take, you know, in the latter part of my talk, I want to take just a little bit of time to look at some representative examples of non-main sequence lunar craters. Well, for a start, you know, we do get on the moon volcanic craters, volcanic calderas. This is the crater Hyginus, probably best known for the Hyginus rill that runs on either side of it. But this is quite different from an impact crater. For the simple reason it's not an impact crater. It is a volcanic feature. It's in a moon a part of the moon that is significant for a range of volcanic features that are on show here. The real giveaway is the fact that volcanic calderas like Hyginus don't have a rim. They are rimless craters, because the rim of, you know, small craters or indeed big craters is created by the impact mechanism, which throws out ejecta to form the rim. And volcanic calderas don't have a pronounced rim in that way. They're also relatively small. You don't get huge volcanic calderas on the moon. They're all within, you know, just a few kilometers, some perhaps in some cases tens of kilometers in size. And as I said before, they're often in the presence of other giveaway volcanic features. The other good example, of course, is the Cobra Head caldera, which is at the head of Schroeter's Valley near the crater Aristarchus. This is a rather fine spacecraft image of the whole of Schroeter's Valley, and you can see the Cobra Head at the top there, the very top left-hand corner of your image. And once again, you can see that it's rimless. Once again, you can see that it's relatively small, and it's almost certainly the source of the lava flow that creates that channel that runs down the length of the Schroeter's Valley. But there are other kinds of non-standard lunar craters that, you know, we can look at just briefly. This next slide shows two examples of something rather interesting. The bottom image shows two very small craters just at the end of the Alpine Valley on the moon. They're only a few kilometers across. They're called Plato K and Plato Ka. And they're adjacent to each other, but they're separated by a rather interesting construct. Can you see that straight line? That straight line between them? That's a giveaway. That's telling you that these two craters are twins, that they were created at the same time by a double impact. And what has happened here is that these two simultaneous impacts have thrown up a curtain of ejecta. And where the craters meet, those ejecta blankets have collided, dropped, to form that straight septum between the two craters. And you also get something similar in the top image here, which is, this is the crater Ariadeus and its neighbor Ariadeus A. Now, these are craters that, had they not been simultaneous, would have been overlapping craters. One would have overlapped the other. But the fact that they are simultaneous, you end up with a similar clue, a straight line. Here it's not a straight ridge between two separate craters. It's a straight join between craters that would otherwise be overlapping, but for the same reason, simultaneity of creation. We talked earlier about, you know, impactors arriving at angles and how, you know, for the most part, whichever angle an impactor arrives at, it's going to create a single point explosion that will create around crater. But if the angle of incidence is so oblique and shallow, you know, if the impactor comes in at such a really shallow angle, perhaps less than 15 degrees, you end up with interesting symptoms and interesting resulting craters. This shows you the crater Messier, which in the image on the right here is the one in the top left-hand corner, and its neighbour, Messier A. And if we just look at that right-hand image first of all, you can see that Messier is kind of gouged out. You know, it's not a round crater, it is an elliptical crater. You can almost see a straight line running down its floor. And what has happened here is that the impactor has come from the top left-hand corner of that image, gouged out at an angle, Messier, explosive as well, not just gouging, but also explosion. It's then ricocheted to form Messier A further down range. And if you look at that from above, as in the left-hand picture, it throws up an interesting ejector pattern. You'll see that there are rays coming out from Messier A, going left from it, comet ray, it's often called, bright rays of material ejector thrown out from the impact. But it's only in the one direction, it's only downrange. The impactor came in from the right of that image, and the ejector goes downrange from the impact. You've also got an interesting dragonfly-shaped wing of bright ejector going out at right angles to the angle of impact. And that's a dead giveaway of an oblique impact. There's nothing uprange. If you look to the right of that picture, there's no sign of any ejector at all. That's the direction from which the impactor came. So again, it's worth looking out for things like that. You also get, keeping an eye on the time here, you also get chains of craters. This is the Hyginus chain that we saw before. This is very simple. This is a volcanic feature. It's a string of volcanic calderas along a line of crustal weakness. But again, it's not exactly mainstream lunar crater. You also get a lot of linear chains of craters created by secondary impacts. This is Copernicus, in the dark on the left-hand side of the picture here. But surrounding Copernicus are chains of shallow secondary impacts, which are created by blocks of material that have been thrown out from the Copernicus impact. And then you've got really interesting crater chains, like the Davy crater chain, which is almost certainly analogous to what happened on Jupiter in when was it, 1994, with comet Shoemaker-Lyrey 9, where an incoming impactor was fragmented by the gravitational field of Jupiter, and the fragments hit the surface separately. The same thing is happening here with the Davy crater chain. You know, something incoming, some block of rubble, got fragmented by the moon's gravitational field and created this chain of craters. We're nearly there. You do get craters also that are floor fractured. This is Gassendi, very famous lunar crater, and you'll see that the whole of the floor of Gassendi is covered in a network of rills, of cracks, of fractures. And this is caused by the uplift of the floor of Gassendi by the intrusion of sheets of magma underneath the surface, lifting the floor and basically cracking it. And there are lots of floor fracture craters on the moon, and they're well worth looking out for. Now, sometimes those fractures are so profound, they're so deep, that the crater then fills with lava and becomes like the crater Vargentin, which you can see here on that image. Again, I'll leave you to work out where it is on that image over there. But Vargentin is a plateau. You know, if you look at the profile on the right-hand side of the image here, there's a cross-sectional profile in red, and it shows you that it's not a crater at all. It was a floor fracture crater once, but it's filled with magma and created a plateau. Right. I'm more or less going to leave it there, I think, because I'm aware of the need to leave a bit of time for questions. I would have mentioned dark halo craters, which have they're basically dark materials thrown out volcanically. In the majority of cases, not in all cases, but usually they're volcanic in origin. And then I would have mentioned, and these really deserve a talk to themselves, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but you get these wonderful concentric craters which have an inner torus. Again, that's not mainstream, is it? And that inner torus, that inner bullseye, again, nobody quite knows what they are. It could be that fractures in the crater have allowed the intrusion of magma along a circular fracture, or it could be a complete slump of the walls, creating a complete ring inside. We don't know, and this is yet another great unsolved mystery posed by my topic for this evening, which is the craters of the moon. Finally, a reminder that this lecture is in honour of this man, George Alcock, dedicated to his memory. David's already said what an outstanding observer he was. He just wasn't an observer of the moon. But he may not have been an observer of the moon, but he may not have liked the craters of the moon, but like the craters of the moon, he knew how to make an impact. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Bill, for that comprehensive explanation of all the different morphologies. It's amazing how much variety there really is on the moon.
He says unconvincingly.
It's all just a lot of holes, really, isn't it? Yeah. Questions? Any questions? Jeremy?
Bill, thank you very much for the presentation. Really, really interesting. How long was the material molten following an impact?
Again, I would guess that would be a consequence of the amount of energy that was released, and therefore attributable back to the size of the impact. I think with relatively simple small craters, it's all over quite quickly, I think. But these larger things, I mean, I think by the time you get up to the multi-ring impact basins, I mean, you're not talking a huge length of time, but you're talking for enough time to have that kind of undulation of the surface, time for the impact melt to flow before it settles, and flow over quite a large area. These craters are 40, 50, complex craters, 40, 50, 60 miles across. So, it's, I think the brief answer is that it depends on scale. But enough time for that sequence of events to occur.
Somebody actually did ask me about Wargentin recently. Why is it unique? And listening to your talk, it seems to me the answer is probably that if craters like that have these floor fractures, then generally they're going to fracture the mountains around the wall as well, and the magma is going to leak out. So it'd be unusual for enough magma to come up, and yet for the walls to be unbreached.
But it doesn't just fracture, as you saw from Gassendi, it doesn't just fracture around the walls. It fractures because of uplift. So you get breaks, in the centre of the crater as well. And clearly there's a huge amount of, as it were, magmatic activity going on in that region. I don't want to go back into the presentation now, but that image of Argentin, the crater next to it, Chicard, which is a huge crater. If you looked at that closely, you'll see that its floor is different colours. And it's different colours because there have been huge leaks of magma that's flowed as lava into the surface of Chicard. So I think it's in an interesting part of the moon in terms of magmatic activity.
Any other points? Nick?
Just a quick one, not so much on the craters, but on people. So you knew Patrick very well, and Patrick was a great proponent of these craters all being volcanic, even right to the end of his life.
If not beyond. If not beyond.
Did he really believe that?
Well, I think, and Paul will probably back me up on this, I think Patrick didn't like being wrong. And think that had a lot to do with it. And also, there's a huge back history here, because in the 1960s, Patrick kind of dug his heels in and kind of carried on a guerrilla warfare with Ewan Whittaker and other lunar scientists on the other side of the pond. And that was over a whole variety of things. It was over what you call the craters of the moon, nomenclature, but it was also over this question of volcanism versus impact. And Patrick always used to say unfairly that nobody who's never looked through a telescope seriously should ever have a right to a view on the craters of the moon. And he applied that to Baldwin, of all people.
Peter.
Yes, you demonstrated from your discussion of crater Messier that you get an outflow ejector downwind, if you like, and then at 90 degrees to it.
You're not going to ask me why,
why
are you?
Why did he get a sort of continuous semicircular outflow?
Well, I think again because of the I suppose because at that low level of impact, the excavation bit of the process is stronger. Well, not necessarily stronger than the explosive impact, but it has a bigger presence and a bigger impact, and therefore throws out, digs up, excavates the material, and throws it downrange. I can't for the life of me explain why it goes out sideways too, but it does. There are better examples, perhaps, that I could have used this evening. If you look at the crater Proclus, which is on the edge of Mare Crisium, that's got a very distinctive pattern of ejecta, whereby there's a V-shaped area to the west of Proclus, which has got no bright rays at all, and then it's got the sideways rays going out, and then a semicircle of rays downrange. And there it's that zone of avoidance that is the giveaway, where there are no rays at all. That tells you the direction that the impactor came from.
Yes, this gentleman.
With the multi-ring basins, you said that the ripple theory has been discounted. So are the rings, what's the remainder, what's still there after the ejector's been removed? Or do they actually rise up during the process?
Sorry, I'm not quite, don't quite follow your question.
Are the rings what's left after the ejector's been removed? Part of the original rock, or have they actually risen up?
I think they've probably risen up. I think the general feeling these days is that the rings that are inside a multi-ring impact basin are likely to be analogous to, in terms of the mechanism that created them, analogous to the rebound mechanism that creates central peaks, but on that larger scale now. So peak rings inside the crater, but that the extraneous rings that you see around the larger impact basins are probably the result of this kind of undulation in the crust, which shakes the crust up, and you get these scarps that drop down. Does that answer your question, or skillfully avoid it?
It seems to me the kind of thing that you could possibly investigate with computational modelling, like they do models of the whole universe and its gravitational interactions. So that's the kind of
That's
project.
orders of magnitude easier than modelling something like that. You would need a
I mean, think of the scale. It's
partial differential equations and boundary conditions. It would be quite a problem.
Well, yeah, a few PhDs in that. Ken.
How do you know that in your diagram you show the ejector as 50% of the original surface that is pushed up? How do you know it's 50% ejector and regular 50% underneath? How do you know that?
I don't recognise having suggested there was 50%. It may have been.
I was going by the image.
It may have been implicit in the image. I'm pleased to be able to say at this point that the image is not mine. It comes with permission. It comes from Chuck Wood's book. Do you remember the title? Chuck Wood's book, The Modern Moon. The Modern Moon, which came out, and I think the whole point of that illustration was not so much to take it literally in terms of percentages. I think it was to try and show the different stages of the process, the excavation stage, and then the
Is
modification.
the ejector very deep then, when it goes over the rim?
Yeah, well, there's enough there to create a rim, and then, depending on the size of the crater, there's enough there to throw out blocks of material that can, that can scar the surrounding landscape. And we're just talking about craters here. By the time you get onto impact basins, you've got huge valleys on the moon, thousands of miles from the original point of impact that are scars on the surface caused by ejecta.
Anything else? Robert?
There was a lot of interest. Patrick was very interested in TLPs and lunar domes back in the 60s. So would that be, I'm looking for his lunar bubbles.
Well, I think it's all part of the same package as the lunar bubbles. I mean, Patrick belonged to a generation and indeed a tradition of lunar observers, for which we have to have huge regard, I think, because they achieve so much. But, it was a generation that wanted the moon to be more interesting on a night-by-night basis than it actually is. I mean, the moon is interesting, but it's interesting as a museum. So, my way of thinking, it's interesting as a museum of solar system history, which you can unravel page by page, and it's intriguing. But, you know what it's like going out in January. It's cold, it's freezing, you don't want to go out there knowing that nothing's happened, that it's exactly the same as it was this time last month. And the idea that there might be changes on the moon goes right back to, it goes to Elgar. It goes back to Elgar, if not, well, it goes back before then, but in terms of the British tradition, the modern tradition, Elgar basically mapped them. The reason why he made his map of the moon was he wanted a map that would be so accurate that it would show any changes that occurred. It would be the standard against which you measured observations to see if changes had occurred. And that tradition was carried on by Goodacre and by Wilkins, and Patrick was very much, of course, under Wilkins's wing. So I think it's all part of the tradition here. And if you have that tradition deeply ingrained in you, and if you are also as stubborn, you knew Patrick, if you're also as stubborn as he was, you're not going to let go that easily, are you?
Right, well, I think we'll need to move on, but that was a fascinating talk and a very worthy George Alcott Memorial Lecture.
Thank you,
very much. Next, Peter East is a graduate of Imperial College, and he got a BSc in engineering. He later worked at Mullard Research Laboratories. He was later a technical director at Raycal Defence Systems. He established an international reputation for work in the design of microwave intercept receivers and for work on electronic warfare. He's a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, chartered engineer, fellow of the Institute of Engineering and Technology, and he's got an OBE for services to the UK defence industry. But now he is retired and he's very involved with amateur radio astronomy. And today he's going to talk about the amateur radio detection of pulsars. So Peter East. It's all on LinkedIn.
Oh,
yeah, so I hope it's accurate. Right, thank you. Here we go. Let's slideshow to from beginning. And these are the buttons.
That's it? Which one is that?
This is to advance the slides.
Oh, right,
The red
okay,
one in the
great.
middle is the red pointer.
Okay, jolly good. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for inviting me here. It's a while since I've given the talk, so bear with me. Are there any radio astronomers here?
I have a simple radio telescope. It's very more an
Great.
interesting thing, but
Well, I was going to start by saying that optical astronomy is probably the oldest, most ancient science. And I guess it was started by an early human being, probably about 2 million years ago, looking up at the sky and recognizing patterns in the sky. Radio astronomy is much, much younger. It's less than 100 years old. And it was, I've got to put, sorry. It's less than 100 years old. In 1933, Karl Jansky used this enormous and rotatable antenna and discovered that radio waves were emanating from the centre of our galaxy. The BAA got interested in about the 1950s and started a radio and electronics section. A key figure joining at that time was a chap named Frank Hyde. In 1933, he was a whiz kid of electronics. And within 2 years, he built his own radio telescope. And in 1950, when the BAA started their radio astronomy group, he joined, and he had a variable time with the BAA. And in fact, Martin Moberly has written a history about Frank's time. But he was, certainly in that time, he was a great guy. He wrote a couple of books on amateur radio astronomy, probably the first person to write books. And in fact, he started me online because I used to take a magazine called The Radio Constructor, and he wrote some articles in that telling you how to build a radio telescope. This is Frank's radio telescope receiver. He bought a Martello Tower near Clacton where he lived, and he's got a load of equipment in here. It was probably very expensive, probably XWD at the time. You can see that there are some, his data was recorded on paper chart tape. You can see the 3 lines of it in this. There were no PCs in those days. After Frank left the BAA in a sad way, I think, the radio astronomy group kind of waned, but it was rejuvenated by Lawrence Newell in the 2000s, and he organised a conference in Northampton, which I attended, and I think it's grown since then. Following coordinators were Paul Hyde, Jeff Lashley, John Cook, and lately Paul Hearn, who's recently promoted to a directorship before it was a coordinator, and he's taken the group to a new level. We've got our own forum now, which people can write to for advice, or they can submit their results. That's a bit of background to get down to what we're talking about today, so I can introduce the rest. First, I'm going to explain what a radio telescope is and what it can do for you. Then talking about sources that are open to amateurs to detect. The most difficult targets are pulsars. I got involved with pulsars in about 4 or 5 years ago. I had been interested in astronomy. I joined the radio astronomy group, and I started building a radio telescope for the hydrogen line. And I managed to collect some data from the hydrogen in the galaxy arms and plotted a reasonable picture. But at that time, when I'd finished that, I was contributing to another forum, and there was a big argument going on about the possibility or impossibility of amateurs being able to detect pulsars. because they were such a weak source. I'll get on to that in a minute. But today we're in a position where there's so much great cheap technology around that you can put a radio telescope together for a reasonable sort of cost and do some useful work. So what's a radio telescope? I can see it here. It's basically just a radio receiver with an antenna that you can steer. It can usually only detect one target at a time, but basically it's just an antenna, a low noise amplifier. LNA stands for a low noise amplifier. You can get some very low noise amplifiers these days. An RF filter, this is just to define the bandwidth that you want to operate in, because there's a lot of TV signals and things like that that we call interference. And then a couple more amplifiers to raise the level up and then into a receiver. In the olden days, this used to be a communications receiver, which were very expensive. But there's been a big change over the past few years, which I'll tell you about in a while. So this gets plugged into a receiver now. You digitize the data into a PC, and then you have some software processing for detecting the signals and plotting the data at the output. So most targets only measure one target at a time. And we use either drift scan, using the Earth's rotation and movement for you to scan the target to measure its size or whatever. Professionals are now building the square kilometre array, which I guess most of you know about, with when their plan is really to answer the questions of life, the universe and everything. But I think other people are doing that as well nowadays. Okay, what sources can be used? This is quite a busy slide, so I'll run you down. On the left-hand side is the sort of power level or flux you get from the various sources. And these are measured in Janskis. And the Jansky is a very small unit. It's 10 to the minus 26 watts per meter squared per hertz of bandwidth. And on the right-hand side is an equivalent temperature that you collect from that source using a 1 meter squared dish antenna. And so you can see that if you look at the left, the light blue, at about 300,000 Janskis, there's the galactic plane, and that's round about 20 megahertz was where Jansky did his measurements. So he was picking up a signal of about 300,000 Janskis. And for comparison, that level of flux received by a 1 meter dish would be the same as the power generated by random electron motions in a 50 ohm resistor load. So it's quite an achievement that he had, even that he did have quite a large antenna. There are several other sources that you can use. We mainly use the sun, which is the strongest source, to check your receiver sensitivity and the antenna beam width. Use the sun motion scan so that you can detect the power level. Probably the most interesting and important one is the hydrogen line at 1420 megahertz. It's the vertical blue line down the center. The hydrogen line is generated by the occasional flip of a hydrogen atom in space upside down, and it generates a photon at 1420 megs. there's an awful lot of hydrogen in the galaxy, and even though the flip ratio is very rare, probably once in a million years per hydrogen atom, there's loads of hydrogen out there and lots of signal level generated for you to detect. It's an easy target for amateurs, and I started that way and produced, as I said, a fair map of the galaxy arms. Earthbound electric in our radio frequency interference, RFI we call it. It comes from cars, people mowing their lawn, DIY tools, solar panels, TV and everything. And this is quite a serious thing, and if you go near any of the major telescopes, the mobile phones are banned. So, although one advantage that radio astronomers have over optical astronomers is that we can work both during the day and during the night, and there's less interference at night, so we have early hours too. Right, so getting down to pulsars now. What is a pulsar? A pulsar is a neutron star. It's the remnant of a supernova that is collapsed by gravity down to about 15 kilometers in diameter. Just like a skater, it conserves its rotational energy and its magnetic energy. So it ends up as this very high power magnet rotating very fast, once a second, or the fastest rotates in about 33 milliseconds. So the result is this magnetic field rotating in a sort of plasma soup that's left after the supernova explosion, and it generates electromagnetic signals out of the poles. It accelerates electrons, the magnetic field accelerates electrons and generates this electric field out of both poles. And if the pulsar happens to rotate such that one of these beams passes through the solar system, then we receive that as a pulse burst of energy. They're very, very accurate clocks. The spin down rate of a pulsar is very, very slow. It's millions of years. They've got atomic clock type of accuracy. And the professionals are actually now using the pulsars that they can measure with their huge dishes to detect gravitational waves, the very long gravitational waves. About 3,000 have been detected so far. The pulsar heroine is Jocelyn Bell. As a Cambridge graduate, she was in charge of this antenna. It was 4 acres, 16,000 square meters. And she was measuring the size of stars and things in the sky at 80 megahertz. And she discovered this regular pulsing every 1.3 seconds. And she was using charts at the time, these chart recorders, so she was feeding out miles and miles of this paper. And but she did discover the tapes. Fortunately for amateurs, there is one strong pulsar in the northern hemisphere and one strong pulsar in the southern hemisphere, and it's just within the capability of us to be able to detect. They're usually denoted by a number. I think the Jocelyn Bell's pulsar was PSRJ 1919 plus 21. The 1919 is the right ascension, 19 hours, 19 minutes, and the plus 21 is the elevation. So what are the pulsar defining properties? Now, very wideband noise sources, there's far more power at low frequencies than high frequencies. So to detect them, it's best to go to the lower frequencies. They're dispersed in frequency, which means that because of interaction with electrons in the path, the lower frequencies are delayed more than the higher frequencies. So you have to de-disperse them, you have to slow the high frequencies up so that the pulses overlap, so that you get the maximum power. They're a continuous pulse train with a nominal pulse width. The pulse width does change from pulse to pulse, but we don't often see that. They're a very accurate period, as I said earlier. They're atomic clock sort of accuracy. They're a predictable period Doppler offset. One of the problems that we face is, although the pulsar that you want to detect has a defined rotation rate and a defined pulsing frequency, because of the Earth rushing around the sun, the period gets Doppler shifted. So we have to go to some special software to predict what the actual frequency, what the pulsar period would be at your location at the time that you do the measurement. But that's pretty straightforward. They also scintillate in amplitude, just like VHF signals vary as they bounce off planes and things. The pulse by pulse amplitude fluctuates in a sort of random way in both amplitude and frequency. The way we detect pulses is using a special algorithm that we call the fold-in algorithm, or some people say it's synchronous detection. Basically, if you look at the top, you record a lot of data and you cut that data up into exact time periods equal to the period that they predict for your measurement. And then you add them all together, as I've shown there in the table on the left. This is real data you're looking at here. So there are 4 sections of data that when you add them up, the pulsar, if all the periods are exactly the same, the pulsar always appears at the same phase. So when you add them up, the pulse amplitudes add linearly, the random noise by the side adds incoherently, adds as power, or the square root of voltage. So when you add them together, the signal to noise ratio increases. As you can see with the blue at the bottom is actually the sum of those 5 period plots above. Right. To give you an idea of I mentioned that they were very low signal levels, and I showed you the chart where pulsars were right at the very bottom. We're talking about 500ths of with the sort of with this B0329 plus 54 pulse in the northern hemisphere. The power that we get from that is equivalent to about 500ths of a degree Kelvin per meter squared received within a 1 meter squared antenna per polarization. And when you think that most receivers are probably maybe 100 to 200 degrees equivalent noise temperature, then that fold-in algorithm has got a lot of work to do to pull it up. So what it really means is that you need either long recording times, multiple hours, or very wide bandwidths. This is real pulses from not going to work. This blue plot is, these are actual pulses of BAA 329, the strongest pulsar in the Northern Hemisphere. And this is a 45-second recording on the 40-meter antenna at the Stanford Research Institute. I've been talking to a colleague there. And so this is an actual sequence of pulses that they receive with a 40-meter dish. That's what I get with my receiver. And in fact, this is, whereas the top one is 45 seconds, the bottom one is a compressed 4 3/4 hour recording. Now, in that recording, I've split it up into 128 fold periods. But within that, there are some pulses, and I don't know whether you can see them. They're in black here. So what I've done is, because I know where the pulsar is in phase, I can just select the power at that point, and that's what you're seeing there. But when you add all of those together, you get something like this. This is with a small system. It's a very small signal-to-noise ratio, just under 5 to 1. Right. So what's a minimum pulsar telescope like? This is, I've replaced, this is the same slide as before, but I've replaced the antenna with a twin Yagi system that I've built. My telescope works at 600 megahertz, and those are 2 TV type aerials. They're called Yagis, and they're 2.5 meters long. Fortunately, BAA 329 is almost overhead, so having it close to the garage and things like that doesn't matter. The important change for pulsars is the receiver is replaced by an SDR, and the SDR is hit by a GPSDO. Now, the SDR is a software-defined radio. That might frighten some, but basically it's a TV dongle that you used to be able to buy for about £5. You could plug it into your laptop. It'd come with a disc and a little aerial. You'd stick the aerial by the window. You put the disc in, and that would show up all of the TV channels. You select a TV channel, and you can watch the TV on your laptop or your computer. But a couple of clever software engineers thought this is a useful little device. We'll write a little program for it to turn it into a receiver. Now, that little £5 SDR replaced what used to cost for a communications receiver, which the amateurs used to use, costing several £1,000s. So it's really been a game changer in radio astronomy. It's a disruptor, I think they call it these days. So it's made the difference, so that with this technology, the cost of it is it brings radio astronomy right into everybody's hands. And a number of schools are getting interested in having their own radio telescopes as well. This is the dongle. Just that little thing is designed for TVs. Since that's been around, there's been a lot of other software-defined radios that have come out, and I in fact use the AirSpy. This one only has a narrow bandwidth for TVs of about 2.5 megahertz. The AirSpy has a 10 megahertz bandwidth And as I said earlier, you know, bandwidth is very important. The GPS-DO is a GPS disciplined oscillator. And once again, you can buy these quite reasonably now. You know, when GPS first came out, it was enormously expensive for a receiver. But this unit here, for £150, can generate a clock that's accurate to 1 part in a billion, which is almost atomic clock accuracy. Because the pulsar period is so exact, one of the key identifiers is that the period that you measure is exactly what is predicted by tempo. And so you do need an accurate clock to be able to measure what you've received. And a GPS disciplined oscillator, this plugs into, you can open it up and put in a connector to this and lock this to achieve that sort of accuracy. Once again, a few years ago, the cost of these things would put it right out of people's courts. For antennas, really for pulsars, you need a very large antenna. And we're talking about really 2 or 3 meters, 10 feet at least. But my research has been to look at using small backyard antenna systems and looking in detail at the processing to see whether you can identify and if you can validate and verify that you are in fact picking up a pulsar and you're not just looking at random noise spikes, which was easy for people to do in the past. So the sort of antenna choices for amateurs are a dish, a parabolic dish. As I said, that below a couple of meters, they are not very efficient. But above a couple of meters, they can be useful. I've used the bottom one at the center, the Yagi. There are lots of design tools on the internet so that you can build your own Yagis. I built mine to these designs. But the 3D corner reflector is a very useful one. It has some very good characteristics. It points the beam up for a start, and it's got very low side lobes. It's not susceptible to noise temperature coming in from the outside. If you build your own antennas or you buy an antenna and you want to tune it up, you need some test equipment. And this is a vector impedance analyzer. You can buy one for less than £100 now. They used to be £10,000, £20,000 to do the sort of job that these devices can do now. And there's plenty of information on the internet on how to use them. The key component is the first low noise amplifier. Now there are low noise amplifiers advertised on eBay. They're a bit suspect. If you really want a calibrated noise figure, then you have to pay the money and go to somebody like Mini Circuits. But even so, they're still only of the order of £90. When I was working, an amplifier of this sort of capability would have cost £10,000, £20,000 just for one amplifier. What's brought the price down is mobile phones. There's been so much technology work done on these that very low noise transistors have been produced. High electron mobility transistors are a very low noise figure. So they're just the job for what we need. For filter design, once again, that's very easy to do. There are design aids on the internet. I've built mine to this design aid. The filter that I've got there, it shows you it's passband. It's got very good out-of-band response. I built that from 1 inch by 1/4 inch aluminium bar, 1/4 inch copper rod, some M6 bolts, a couple of bits of aluminium sheet and lots of self-tapping screws. I did that in a day. So the next bit of test equipment you need is a spectrum analyzer. When you build your receiver, the receiver chain, you want to check that the filter is tuned correctly and the gain is correct, and you need to quantify those things. And once again, this spectrum analyzer and the green circuit board there is a noise source. So you use the noise source in front of your filter and then look at its spectrum, and that's the way you tune the filter spectrum. The next thing you need is software, test and recording software. For testing, there's the SDR Sharp, and for antenna pointing, radio eyes are Stellarium. For data recording, for the RTL, the TV dongle, there's RTL SDRX from Osmocom. They've produced software, free software for you to use. An important one that most amateurs tend to move on to is GNU radio. I'll say a little bit more about that in a while. So this is SDR Sharp. You can see it's tuned to the frequency I use, 611 megahertz. And this is checking the bandpass of the my receiver. Next bit of useful software is antenna pointing and timing. This is radio eyes. It costs a little bit of money, not a lot. It has the interesting feature that you can put your antenna beam pattern on it, and so you can see when the source goes into your beam and when it goes out of your beam, so you can do that timing. This is in fact pointing at B3029. The GNU radio, it's an interesting concept. Basically, they build things as flowcharts, but there's a lot of software that's built around it. The red box at the side is the software defined radio control. You set up the frequency, you set up the bandwidth, and so on. And then this drives the blue box, which is a digital channelizer. It's a fast Fourier transform, much, much cheaper than a bank of filters, which people used to have to use to channelize the data. You need to channelize the data so that you can block out channels that have got serious interference in. The green boxes do the detection and averaging, just like the square law detector used to do, and a capacitor. And on the right-hand side, the magenta one is the data file output. There's lots of pulsar analysis software out there. There's the professional stuff, which is all in Linux. We're talking about Tempo, Presto, SIGPROC. That's all available on the internet. Tempo is the software that you need to determine the period of the pulsar that you're measuring, depending on your location and the time that you're making the measurement. Now, Andrea Delimagin and his son, Giorgio Delimagin, they built a pulsar site that continued to measure the pulsar on a day-by-day basis. He was probably the first amateur with a relatively small antenna to demonstrate that pulsar detection was well within the amateur's capability. Marcus Leach has produced some software specifically for GNU radio, which will do everything that you need it to do. Michael Clausen has written some software which is made available for the RTL dongle. So if you're planning to use that, and I've written some software which I have on my site, which people can use, download. For systems, this is Andrea Dell'imagine's antenna, garden size antenna. As I said, he had this site working for 2 or 3 years, and he regularly used to get good signal to noise ratios. It was only a 2.5 meter squared aperture, but he was using 400 megahertz, and the RTL, the dongle, for 2.4 megahertz. This is the output of which a lot of amateurs use, is the Presto output. So basically, you record your data with your GNU radio special software or Andrea's software, and you feed it into this program called Presto, and Presto outputs a plot like this. It's got a lot of features so that you can remove radio frequency interference and so on. The important thing is at the top left, you can see the pulses. The grey boxes, you can't quite see because the signal is a bit small, is a time waterfall and a frequency waterfall. So if you've really got good eyesight, you might be able to see a couple of lines down those. The important one is the little box at the bottom with the hump there. That's showing that the dispersion that he's measured for this pulse is exactly right. It's got a dispersion measure of 27. And on the right-hand side, you're checking the period rate and the period accuracy and the period rate accuracy. And they produce that plot at the bottom where you're supposed to get a peak right in the center. But because it's a relatively small signal, it's not so clear. This is my complete system. The antenna's on the left, you've seen before. The receiver is in the center, showing you the AirSpy receiver. The GPS DSO is on the back. And on the right-hand side, I've got this big aluminium box with my PC in it so that the antenna can't see the noise generated by the PC. And the PC does all the recording. And this is my best result from BO329. It's a signal to noise ratio of about 9 to 1. I don't always get it like this. Most measurements are swamped by radio frequency noise. Okay, so for amateurs validating whether you really have got it, the period has to be correct, the pulse width has to be correct. To see it simulating, the data scintillating is important, and multi-band, see that it's present in several bands. The period rate, the period and the period rate search peak has got to be there. And the important ones are dispersion, that you do measure the correct dispersion. This is one that really does tell you that it comes from outer space. And the last one is a drift trends central peak. Since we keep the antenna still and the Earth rotates round, you expect maximum signal in the center, and that's just a confirmation, really. This is my take on the Presto plot. I think mine's a bit clearer, but I'm very happy with that. All of those show that it really is they are the characteristics that we're expecting. So finally, now is probably the best time ever to get into radio astronomy. There's lots of high-performance electronics availability of lots of design aids, lots of test software and processing software, and lots of cheap test gear. And the whole thing's very PC friendly. It's a low-cost entry into radio astronomy. There are a lot of easier sources than pulsars. And what I advise anybody, if they are enthused, to try hydrogen. It's a relatively easy target for you. You can measure the arms in the galaxy, and you can measure the rotation rate, and you can prove to yourself and your family that dark matter really exists. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I've never heard a talk on this subject before. In fact, I had no idea that amateurs could detect pulsars.
Well, they can. This one can.
Do you think we have any chance of discovering new ones?
No.
Right.
No. These two pulsars that I spoke about, the one in the northern hemisphere and the lower hemisphere, they're both about 1.5 Janskis. Most pulsars are in just a few millijanskis. So you really do need a big dish. I know people who've got, who are into, radio amateurs who are into Earth, Moon, Earth things. They've got 7-meter dishes. And I know of one chap who's detected about 15 different ones. In fact, I've recently I've been contacted and provided some data by somebody with a 7-meter dish and it's been useful for me to prove out my software. But, yeah, you really need a bigger dish. It's hard work.
Any other questions? Jeremy.
A couple of questions. So your Yagis are stationary. Is there any advantage to having a tracking system?
Oh yes. Well, all of the people with big dishes track the targets. An advantage of I probably didn't say this. The advantage of a small antenna, it has a wide beam width, so you can track if you want to, but for instance, with my antenna, it takes about 4 hours to go across with the Earth to scan, so I can get a 4-hour long recording. Whereas with a large dish with, say, 1 degree beam width, it'll only be 5 minutes. In fact, there's a colleague in Canada. He's inherited a 25-meter dish, and he hasn't quite got the tracking working yet. And he's had worse results than me, just doing drift scan, even though it's a 25-meter dish. So tracking is, the colleague that gave me some data for me to check, these were, he was tracking for 9 hours. So they're enormously big files.
Okay.
My software takes over an hour just to run it. So.
May I ask a supplementary
Yep.
question? So in my youth, I tried some radio astronomy, and local noise was a real problem, like my father shaving at a certain point.
Yes, yeah.
Can you say something about your local noise sources and how you avoid them?
Well, early morning. I've done most of my measurements in the early hours of the morning, say from 1 o'clock till 5 o'clock, because less people are working. PCs generate. I've got a neighbour with a very powerful PC system, and I can pick him up very easily. And it's very difficult. As far as RFI is concerned, if it's very narrow band, TVs are very wide band, so you really need, some amateurs have 50 meg wide receivers, and so they can afford to block out 10 megs here or there. But with a narrow band of 10 megs, if anything gets into it, it usually destroys what you're doing. But very spiky noise, for instance, you can chop off.
Anything else quickly? Robert?
Just a comment. I've got two simple radio telescopes, right? I was doing a search for small telescopes on the internet, and I couldn't believe I came up with a radio telescope. And this thing ended up costing me hundreds and hundreds of pounds with postage from America. But if I was good at electronics, I'd probably be able to make it for under 100 quid. And it's basically a little dish, like a wok, like a satellite dish. And it comes with a little receiver, which is like a Freeview box, and it's like something out of a lab, and it's got a little needle that moves. And what you do is, if you point it straight up at the sky, the needle goes to the midway. If you point it at the sun, it goes off the scale. And what I love, if I point it at the moon, it goes to about 6 on the scale. And that's the solar radiation bounced off the surface of the moon to my little telescope. So then the next stage of that was I've got a data recorder thing. It's like a little box that costs about 50 quid. And that makes the analog to digital. It goes into your PC and you get the zigzag line. And I thought, well, this is great. I can use this because it's cloudy a lot. I'm up at the observatory and out in the balcony and all that. But damn it, has to be clear because it's KU band or something. So if it's cloudy, it doesn't work. And the other one, you can find this on the internet. It's a radio telescope for looking at Jupiter Io. And I got one of the guys in the Dundee Astronomy Society built it for me. And it's like a chicken wire, square of chicken wire, 4 dialing sticks, a copper wire ring, and a little shortwave radio. Point this at the planet Jupiter, and you tune in the radio, and you can pick up the shortwave Jupiter. So 2 simple radio telescopes.
There is a group that do the Jovian telescope.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can buy one from UK RAA.
Yeah.
I'm making one out of a wok.
Yeah.
We'll look forward to that. Right, thank you very much again, Peter. Lastly today, Tim Parsons. Tim is a BAA trustee. He's a retired solicitor, and he's doing a PhD in astrophysics at UCL and helping with the teaching there. So now we're going to have the Sky Notes.
None of that means I'm able to operate this, so let's
Are they on here anywhere?
They're supposed to be.
They're where everything else is. They should be on.
Oh, there it is. No, there it is.
Found
There.
it?
Is that it?
Super. No, that's not the watch. No, it's
There it is. It's firing up now. And then... Yeah, that's right. And can we put it on screen? Slideshow. Oh, no, just on full screen.
Enable external content. What had that could it possibly be? That's your YouTube.
Oh, that'll be the link.
That's the YouTube link. Yeah.
Can we just click down to the second button and OK? Let's see if this works. Hang on. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Thanks. So I can use either. And that is a yes. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I think we're probably running a bit short of time, so we'll try and race through this. Those of you who were here at the Christmas meeting a couple of years ago may remember that I stood up here for the first time on one day's notice to give a talk. I've had a little bit more notice this time, and I foolishly volunteered off the back of that last talk to be willing to do Sky Notes occasionally. Here's the first go at it, so let's hope for the best. The trick with Sky Notes is to try and be topical, but actually have it ready in time. We were talking about that upstairs earlier. And also thinking about how far back can I go. Not all of you will have been up at Greenock when Nick, I think, did Sky Notes there. So we'll jump back a bit to Eclipse Matters back in April, and quite a few people in this room participated in that. I really liked this image that Nigel Evans took from Torreon in Mexico. And actually, Nigel, if I haven't wrecked your image, there we are. I just thought I'd use it as the introduction slide as well. I think it was just taken with a GoPro. I didn't write it on there, but it was it's very simple and straightforward. Torreon has a fictional space connection, in case you don't know. It's the city in Mexico where the actor Ricardo Montalban grew up. And for those who are Star Trek fans, he played Khan. He was also the star in Fantasy Island many years ago, for those that remember dreadful TV.
Tenuously.
Very tenuous. I thought I'd find one. I quite like this too, from Nick Quinn, which was a really thorough sort of environmental measurements analysis taken on site, again, near to Torreon. And what's quite interesting is the temperature variations you can see there in red, sort of following totality. And also the lack of symmetry in the light levels and the cooling down and the warming up afterwards. So obviously these slides will all be there to look at on the YouTube channel in due course. So there's a lot of information there, but I'd really recommend having a look at that at your leisure. Diamond rings are always beautiful. This I thought was particularly nice from Mark Forrest up at Cape Girardeau in Missouri on the banks of the Mississippi River. A rather nice second contact image there. And I've actually got two second contact diamond rings, because this one is the BAA logo, straight off. I mean, it couldn't be more perfect. So well done to Michael O'Connell, who was over in Mena, Arkansas, which is a town that has some unfortunate connections with drug running into Mexico and that sort of thing, but we'll leave that to one side for now. But a lovely image that Michael took, and just captured some beautiful prominences. Whoops, sorry, I'm always doing that with this thing. Around the edges here, and just a really perfect representation of our own logo. Thanks to Jeremy for sending me some of this information, and some of these pictures will appear in the journal in due course. But there was an expedition that a number of members took to Leakey, not Leakey, Leakey, Texas, down near the Mexican border. And Richard Seven did this lovely set of images taken at 14-minute intervals of the whole of the eclipse from start to finish. You can see there was some cloud effects at the beginning there. You can also see sunspots quite nicely, which we'll come to in a moment. The sun features quite a bit, as you'd imagine, in Sky Notes at the moment. But well done to Richard for that. Just done with a very nice setup with a Canon 6D camera and a 600mm lens. And indeed, you can actually see it being set up here. So here is, Sir Arthur Eddington, eat your heart out, the great Dawson 7 Shears total eclipse expedition to Leakey, Texas. And thanks to Debbie Shears for the picture. The thing that struck me about this is kneeling down, wearing shorts in rural Texas. I don't know if anybody mentioned fire ants, but I wouldn't wear shorts and kneel down for very long in Texas, just as a warning. A very brave or foolish thing to do. But there is the setup that produced those lovely images that we just saw. Leakey, Texas is a city. I did look it up. The latest census population is 315, so it's a classic sort of rural American city. And here is a citizen of Leakey, many years ago now, but it's the only picture I could find of the main street. And Jeremy may have some other pictures of the main street, but a characterful southwest Texas town. Now is this actually going to work? Is that running? Yes, it is. That is actually a movie that's running. Do you remember when the sun was like this a few years ago? That's over a week of the sun. Yeah. And we thought we'd never see sunspots ever again. It was just an incredible minimum some years ago. So that is a whole week of the sun. Now we start to see the sun coming to life. And a very nice image from Roger Samworth, which Peter Meadows posted on the BAA galleries. A nice sequence over a few hours of a prominence on the solar limb. But of course, all the action has been AR3664, which we're all very familiar with now. An interesting orientation of this image from Ken Kennedy, firstly proving that the sun does shine around Dundee. But actually, I really quite liked this oriented in this way because I've always been a fan of sort of images of the moon particularly, but also the sun. And you see it with some of the JunoCam images of Jupiter, where you really feel like you're actually traveling over the surface yourself. So I thought this was quite a nice way to put it. It's a very impressive sunspot group. And of course, there's another image of it from Raffaello, taken from Rome, I think it is, he's based in Italy. And this sunspot group became very famous for reasons which I think we're all familiar with, but we'll have a look at in just a moment. Paul, I've grabbed a couple of your sketches because it's nice to see people drawing things. I'm hopeless at it, so I'm always impressed by your efforts, Paul. But even more so, I love the idea of doing a sketch in H-alpha, which I don't think I've seen many people do before, but there's two. They're not particularly connected, they're on different dates, but 3664 is there on the integrated white light sketch. And you can see some lovely filaments on the H-alpha sketch as well.
I'd probably confess that I didn't plot every single point of granulation on the
H-alpha. It's a random given filter that gets the right texture.
Yes. A lot of stippling going on. So please draw, please draw. And there we have from Luigi Moroni in Italy again, a lovely close-up H-alpha image of 3664 and 3668. And this just amazed me when I saw this one, that we can do this as amateurs. I mean, isn't that just beautiful? And thanks to Mattia Piccoli for this from up in northeastern Italy in Udine. It's, as you see, a fairly simple setup. It's the very narrow bandpass, half an angstrom, and you just get this beautiful. I understand these solar-ready telescopes can be specifically tuned and set either to prominence or photosphere levels of focus. So it's just quite astonishing because I mean, at half an angstrom bandpass, focusing remains sort of quite a challenge, or keeping things in focus. But I just thought that was really rather impressive that as amateurs, this sort of thing can be produced. So the active region 3664, which has produced so much excitement and interest in recent times, how big was it? Well, I think everyone in this room and online has heard of the Carrington event of 1859 and is familiar with it. There's a nice comparison that spaceweather.com put together, and thanks to Lynn Smith and Peter Meadows for pointing this one out to me. AR3664 is actually larger than the sunspot group that gave rise to the Carrington event and the sort of dramatic consequences that occurred there. And I think Peter Meadows mentioned to me that he has estimated that it's the 12th largest sunspot group in the Greenwich catalogue that's been going since the mid to late 19th century. So it really was a pretty dramatic active region on the sun. I think it produced something like 12 X-class flares in the space of a week around the time in early May that produced such dramatic atmospheric results here on Earth. And just sort of if we carry on with that theme, if I can make this actually play. Yes. So that's the SDO sort of live image from around the 8th and 9th of May. And pretty dramatic stuff. Remember, the field of view on this is about 30 million miles across. It goes out to about half the orbit of Mercury. So we move on to why was that so exciting? Simon Dawes very nicely put together this poster, Cause and Effect, which sums it up perfectly. There is our famous active region here. There is the close-up of it. And when it reached the Earth, this is what we got. And many of you, sadly not me, were up in Greenock to see this after dinner. But of course, it was visible all across the British Isles, except where I was. It was actually hazy and cloudy in rural Sussex, where I happened to be, which was pretty annoying. But even further south, down into mainland Europe and so on, really quite an astonishing event. And I mean, we could kind of show pictures of this for the rest of the evening, but Simon, thank you for that, because I think that really joins together the sun and the earth quite nicely, actually. And we'll have a few pictures. There's a story behind this one, as I understand it, which was Steve Knight locked into Greenock Bowling Club and having to climb the fence to escape, but nevertheless sending this image and putting it on the gallery whilst trapped. And I think you can see, I'm always doing this, I'm sorry. I've spoiled it now. Corona Borealis there. So it's a corona aurora in Corona Borealis, but there we are. Just done with an iPhone. So we were talking just now about the technological advances that mobile telephones have produced. It's really quite astounding, the image quality you can get from a half-second picture. Moving on, Ken Kennedy again, up in Broughty Ferry near Dundee. Beautiful curtains. I mean, really just astonishing shapes and images. And I mean, there are hundreds of these we could have shown, but I just picked a few that I thought looked interesting and looked pretty, if you like. Michael O'Connell, again, back in Kildare in Ireland, sent in this image, which, again, is just an iPhone photo, but isn't it beautiful? And really quite astounding. And then, slightly more scientifically, Robin Ledbetter, of course, has been attacking aurorae with spectroscopy, just with an Alpi 200, 9 60-second exposures integrated together. So there we have it visually. Oh, I'm sorry. There we have it visually. Very nice. And here, as Robin put it, is a surprisingly complex spectrum. And Robin, I hope you don't mind, but I've tried to add in the sort of the colours, but also the sources of those spectral lines. So mainly ionized molecular nitrogen at the blue and violet ends, ionized atomic nitrogen, neutral atomic nitrogen, neutral atomic oxygen, producing the lovely green effects at 5577 angstroms. And then the red coming from these two oxygen lines here, and a number of others down into the infrared. And there, as you can see in this spectrum, there's loads of other lines there. It really is quite lovely detail, actually. So thank you, Robin, for that one. And I hope you don't mind me sort of adding a bit onto it. So that active sunspot group is still there. It's come back around as 3697. So it survived its passage all the way around the sun and has come back again. And there's an image, thanks to Kevin at Solarham over in Canada, labeling all the current groups from just a recent image. And I've just put a slightly more recent image from SDO on the right there, unlabeled, but it shows you that same region. This was just from 2 days ago, progressing across the sun. So there's been a very persistent and active sunspot group. And lastly, I just like this one. It's been posted on the BAA gallery just recently, but thank you, Anton Matthews, down in Bristol. Look at those filaments. I mean, it's just incredible stuff here, and some beautiful prominences around the limb. So again, a double-stacked Solar Max 60, so really narrow band pass, but beautiful detail shown there. Okay. It's June and coming into summer. So what do we think of? We think of noctilucent clouds, and they're appearing already. So here's a nice image from Denis Buzinski, way up in Tarbert Ness. And remember, the noctilucent clouds are much, much higher in the atmosphere than clouds that you will normally see. I think around 80 kilometers up in the mesosphere. And you'll see them long after sunset, glowing basically from the reflected light of the sun that's well below the horizon at this stage. So keep a lookout each night now. The next several weeks is the key time to be seeing them. And this image was, I think there's a date on it, it was in the last couple of days, the night of the 2nd and 3rd. So a very nice one from Dennis up in Tarbert Ness, and another one from Jimmy Fraser in Alness. Again, nice patterning there. So the noctilucent clouds are back. Have a look, and please file any reports to the Aurora and Noctilucent Clouds section to Sandra Brantingham. Okay, so in the traditional Sky Notes way, we'll sort of move to the moon briefly. A very nice limb image there from Lars Lindstad, which I thought I would use just to illustrate a quick list of the upcoming lunar phases. New moon is tomorrow lunchtime, and we move through the phases as we see. The full moon, I hate the way they name all these moons, but on one of the traditions, the full moon on August the 19th is indeed a blue moon. It's the 3rd full moon in a season which has 4 full moons. Apparently that's one of the definitions. So there we are. Going right through the summer, in the full moon of September the 18th, there is a lunar eclipse. It's also, there'll be loads of carry on about supermoons again, because the September and October full moons are both perigee moons. So be prepared for the newspapers to be telling you how huge and bright the moon will be. There will be a lunar eclipse associated with the September 18 full moon. Only partial from here, and I think it's only very slightly partial. It's not a great coverage. I think you need to go to North America if you want the totality for that. The seasons I just mentioned there, so we're just coming up obviously to the summer solstice and the beginning of summer. David, thank you. I wasn't going to swamp you with lunar images because we've had loads of wonderful ones from Bill during his talk. But our president, David Arditi, sent me this rather nice image taken from his observatory in Edgware of the southern lunar limb area. And of course, the southern areas of the moon are in the news at the moment. But David, thank you for that one. I love the sort of limb shots. It really gives you a feeling of floating over the surface yourself. So lots of beautiful detail there. Move to the planets. Mercury. This is from a little while ago, but Chris Hooker has been making quite an effort at imaging the sodium tail of Mercury, and a really nice image there to show the trail of ionized sodium coming off the planet. Really rather nice, and I put that in, although it's from back in March, because I didn't think we would get any images of Mercury, given how close it is to conjunction at the moment. But Martin Lewis has been doing some infrared imaging, and this was from the 2nd of June, but note the time of day, 11 o'clock in the morning. It's amazing what you can do with infrared, but it's rather close to the sun, so a lot of care needed with that one. But again, Martin's compared his actual image here to a WinDUPOS simulation based on suitably degraded Mercury messenger data. And I think, again, you can see there, it matches up beautifully. So well done to Martin with that one. I did not expect any Mercury images. Similarly, Venus, this is an older image, and I think it's been shown before by Nick, but it's been reprocessed, and Peter Tickner and Martin Lewis have done some work on this. And again, a similar thing, comparing, these are ultraviolet views of the night side of Venus. And isn't it astonishing that as amateurs, we can look at features on the night side of Venus. Absolutely incredible. I thought it was worth showing this image again. It's been reposted as having been reprocessed. Venus has just reached superior conjunction, so imaging opportunities and viewing opportunities will be coming up soon. Mars is making its slow way towards its next opposition, which will be in January. A little way away yet. But Clyde Foster down in Namibia has been dutifully imaging it as it's been getting bigger and bigger and more visible. This is the most recent one that's been posted on the gallery website, which you can look at. Mars is steadily growing in size, currently just over 5 arcseconds, but obviously through the autumn, some wonderful viewing opportunities for Mars as it approaches conjunction. I don't mean conjunction, I mean opposition, sorry. Minor planets moving slightly further out. Very nice image by Steve Brown of Pallas. And we also, so Pallas has recently reached opposition. It's readily visible high up in Corona Borealis. Ceres is also reaching opposition, but Ceres is an awful long way south. I think it's about minus 29 declination at the moment. So you'll have to move a bit further south if you want to look at that one. But Pallas is pretty good at the moment and readily accessible around about magnitude 9. Just a quick couple of Jupiter images from Perigeo 61, the most recent pass by Juno. Jupiter's just coming out of its recent solar conjunction. So again, an object to look forward to as we roll through the summer and into autumn. But these were just a couple of nice images from the JunoCam website, where, of course, you can download data yourself and do lots of image processing, as John Rogers and others from here do. We do have, coming up, Mars and Jupiter in very close conjunction. In the morning, well, visible in the early morning on around about the 14th of August. I think their closest approach will be about 18 arc minutes. So a little bit over half of the diameter of a full moon. So that should be quite interesting. In Taurus, it'll be a nice sight to see because you'll have the red Aldebaran nearby as well. So that's one worth looking out for in the early mornings later in August. Saturn, going further out. Ring plane crossing is coming up in early 2025. As you can see, the rings are already very narrow. So an interesting time to be observing Saturn. The couple of images that I've posted here, and thanks to Mike Fuchs for directing me to these, have both, I think, been done from in Australia. So firstly, Andy Cazaly, thank you for that one, and Trevor Barry. This one's particularly interesting because it's the first sighting this time round of this anticyclonic vortex, which I think arose from the Great Storm in around about 2010. And Mike's nodding, thank you. And it's still there, so it's quite persistent. So that's a feature to look out for as Saturn comes back into view. Uranus and Neptune, I've not got images of this time round, but of course they will be coming around into viewing through into the autumn particularly. Neptune is very low down these days, but Uranus will be a terrific object to do some imaging on. It's a nice little project, imaging Uranus and the 5 major moons around it, if you get the chance to do that through the autumn. But let's jump then to comets instead. And this one from Nick James of 2021 S3 Pan-STARRS, which promises to be a bright object as the year wears on. So let's look forward to that one. I quite like this one from Mazen Yunus of 2023 A3 Tsuchinshan Atlas, which has, there are any number of images on that on the Comet section gallery if you want to look at that. But Mazen, as you probably know by now, because I think Nick has shown quite a few of his images before, has a very dark sky site down in Morocco with lovely dark clear skies and can produce some rather nice images like that. 12P, Ponsbrooks, heading a long way south now, and I gather is putting on a pretty spectacular display, but Nick, I still think no reports of post-perihelion outbursts, or have you received any yet?
That's right. No, I haven't actually received many observations because at the moment it's still really difficult to get
Yeah.
from any of the remote telescopes. It's low down at evening twilight.
So yes, we've had a couple of lovely images posted on the gallery, both from actually quite close to each other down in Victoria in Australia. So this one from Rob Kaufman in Bright, which if you ever get the chance, is a very beautiful town in the Victorian Alps. I would thoroughly recommend going there, and stunningly dark, clear skies. And you can get results like this. And then from a little way to the northwest on the Murray River, Swan Hill, from Mike Mattiazzo. So, there's lots of incredible detail there in the tail. So it may well be worth heading down to Australia just to do some observation and imaging of that in the coming weeks. This one we're back to Namibia again. The team of Michael Jaeger, Lucas Demetz, and Gerald Riemann have been on a bit of a campaign at Farm Tivoli down in Namibia, and are sending back some really quite beautiful results there as well. Right, press on. Whoops. That's it. I ought to mention as well Mission 29P, which Richard Miles is running. There's lots of detail about that on the comment section website. Please do have a look. The idea is to consistently and regularly do small aperture photometry on the nucleus, because this undergoes regular outbursts and it's visible from much of its orbit. And it's an unusual comet, not much of a tail. It's a Centaur comet. So please do take observations if you can. Read the instructions about the sorts of observations that are requested. And as you can see, a wonderful light curve of the nucleus, not the integrated light of everything, is being produced to basically map the regular outbursts of 29P Schwarzmann-Wachmann. What do comets produce? They produce meteors, amongst other things. And Callum Potter up in the Orkneys had this rather nice bright Lyrid way back in April now, but I thought it was worth putting on as almost as an excuse just to mention the upcoming meteor showers. The key there, of course, is the Perseids, August the 11th, 12th. Everybody's familiar with them. Lots of fast-moving meteors. The moon is round about first quarter, so it should be well out of the way in the early hours of the morning for Perseid observing. So please do, and the nights should be warm. A brief look to the south, towards the deep sky. The thing that jumps out straight away, this is around about 11 o'clock this evening, is M13 in Hercules and all of the Messier objects which are rising in the southeast as the night wears on. So a lot of things you might want to be seeing, you've got to be willing to be up in the small hours of the morning this time of year. Okay. And then just a view to the north, and we've obviously got Cygnus, and there's lots of lovely deep sky objects in Cygnus to look at, so feast your eyes there. I mentioned M13. Never get tired of looking at wonderful images of M13. It really is just the most astounding globular cluster. It's huge and really quite beautiful. So this one from Carl Frederick Hansen I thought was rather nice. Thanks to Peter Carson for this lovely image of the Seahorse dark nebula in Cepheus. And Peter's put out a plea to think more about deep sky objects. There's some lovely deep sky objects over the summer, in Cepheus, in Cygnus. So please, any good observations you've got, imaging, submit them if you can. This one was taken from Kelling Heath a little while back. And Grant Privet has just posted this one, which is of V2494 Cygni, which is a FUOR. Don't know if you're all familiar with FUORs. They've actually been in the news quite a lot. There's been quite a few papers written about them recently. FU Orionis stars. They're pre-main sequence stars which regularly, well, we think regularly, we've only ever seen them never seen them do this more than once, but they should do, undergo extreme brightening, which is caused by an increase in the rate of accretion onto the protostar from the circumstellar disk around it. And there's a lot being written about them at the moment in the press, in the academic press. So an interesting object to look at, and you can see the nebulosity that gets lit up by the star when it's active there. So worth a look at, one of the nice objects in Cygnus at the moment. And then our old friend Gilberdagian's Nebula and the star that lights it up, PV Cepheid. Mike Harlow's been using one of the eye telescopes over in Utah to take a series of images between March and June. So go and have a look yourselves if you've got the equipment to do it. The thing is, you might not see anything. It seems to be disappearing very much at the moment. So the fading sequence is March through to June in this. But again, a fascinating object in its own right. Variable stars. Jeremy said I had to mention variable stars. Oh, it's the 200th edition of the Variable Star Circular, by the way, has just come out. So if you're not a member of the Variable Star section, apply to Jeremy and you'll get the special 200th edition. Variable stars have made it into the mainstream press, I was surprised to see earlier this week. So the Telegraph had an article which was reasonably correct. It did confuse T Corona Borealis with Corona Borealis a few times, but not to worry. And apparently this is a new star, which isn't really quite true. But anyway, as I think most of us know now, because there's a long BAA history associated with this, and Jeremy has written a number of interesting papers and notes and articles recently. If you haven't caught up with them, you should. There's a really fascinating story around the discovery of the last eruption of this star in February 1946, and also the backstory of how the great Leslie Peltier failed to see it because he had a bad cold. It's a lesson in always go out and look, even if you don't feel well. So any time now, it could be tonight, any time now, this is going to go off, and it will rise from, what's it now, Jeremy, about magnitude 10 to about magnitude 3. It's a symbiotic variable, basically material accreting onto a white dwarf from a red giant. And there's a lovely finder chart that James Waitman put together. So if you go back onto the online version of this, you can pick up that chart to tell you how to find your way to T Corona Borealis. And there's the light curve, which, thanks, Jeremy, sent me the up-to-date version of that. And you can see there's been some variability lately, but we still don't have the eruption. The thing is, when it happens, it's going to erupt and fade quite quickly. So you've got to get it at the right time. A lot of people looking at it, though, but add yourselves to that list. And please submit any observations to the variable star section. Another couple of variables which are the subject of regular campaigns, which Jeremy asked me to mention, are both Mira variables. So these are thermally pulsating red giant branch stars. So unlike the other, where you've got the sort of T-core Bohr type of star, where you've got material accreting onto a star, here, this is actually physical variations in the star itself. And these stars can vary by 11 magnitudes. I mean, that's like 25,000 times in their brightness. Really quite astonishing. And Chi Cygni is probably one of the best known ones. And really, it's a call to submit observations if you can, photometric observations. The other is R Cassiopeia. Oh, sorry, just on Chi Cygni, again, a rather nice image there from James Waitman, which gives you some useful comparison stars for magnitudes. And R Cassiopeia, another one which, as Jeremy has pointed out, has very few regular observers. So if you can, please join the campaign for that. Okay, we're running pretty much out of time. We're not going really into deep sky, but that's as far as I think we'll go. And in the Nick James tradition, I will try and see if this works. This was the bit that we had trouble with. Let's see if, so just to bring us right up to date. it did launch, finally, the Boeing Starliner. Now, what I can't do is...
Here they come, our CFT crew taking their first steps outside.
Unfortunately, this is 20 minutes long, so I'm not going to... But can we, if I can pass through it quickly. Ah, here it is. Yep.
25. Status check. Go Atlas. Go Centaur. Go Starliner.
As most of you know by now, there's been quite a number of failed attempts to get this off the ground. May the 24th, 1962, Scott Carpenter, Mercury Atlas 7. You mentioned it, so I sort of looked it up. And yeah, so the first Atlas launch vehicle on a crewed mission since then.
It's the first human launch at Cape Canaveral since Apollo 7 in 1968.
Houston, Starliner roll.
So there we are.
Roger roll.
So we probably better stop there. It's available if you want to watch on YouTube. I was going to show this, but I think we've run out of time. But just to mention the Chang'e 6 lander, the South Lunar Pole region is going to be politically quite interesting. It's interesting in itself that we've got to this stage, but China has, of course, just launched back from the moon the samples that Chang'e 6 has taken from around the South Lunar Pole on the far side, which is interesting. And, I mean, that's pretty significant, because if we're ever going to settle on the moon or exploit it for resources, that's where we're going to go. So it's politically very interesting that that is now happening. And of course, it's led to a lot of comment in the press and so on. And so I thought I would award the Bad Science of the Week award to the Telegraph again. Not their science correspondent, but their unnamed foreign staff. I blame Pink Floyd, but if I ever see another reference to Dark Side of the Moon, I will get very upset. They do say Far Side of the Moon lower down. But yes, so that's the Bad Science Award for June. That's the end of Sky Notes, and I'm told to remind you that if you'd like to go down the pub, there's a bunch of us gathering in the parcel yards after this. But thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Tim. Commendably concise. And yes, the parcel yard is the pub in King's Cross Station on the upper level of the new part of King's Cross Station. So we have to get out of here now. Thank you very much for the IOP staff for facilitating this meeting, and for Hazel Collett for arranging all the speakers. She can't be here today, but she sends her greetings to you. Thank you very much, and see you here in October for the AGM.
In the US?